How do we know the New Testament documents are written early? There's several reasons. First of all, we know Paul died in 65 or so AD, mid-60s, so he had to have written all of his works before he died. And Luke actually is quoted by Paul. Paul writes in 1 Timothy 5 that a section of Luke is Scripture. So he's quoting Luke as Scripture, which would of course mean Luke had to have been written earlier. We know there are eyewitness details all over these documents. In Acts, from chapter 13 to 28, there's 84 eyewitness details that only an eyewitness would have known. All these are listed in our book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. In the Gospel of John, there's 59 of these details, also listed in I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And then, oh, by the way, there are commentaries early, very early in the 2nd century on the New Testament documents. Obviously, they had to have been written prior to that. And Ignatius, an early church father, by 110 AD, had quoted from 25 of the 27 New Testament books. So these books must have been written in the 1st century for Ignatius to have quoted 25 out of 27 of them. And they're much earlier than the so-called Gnostic Gospels, which came about 100 years later in the late 2nd century.
I often hear students say, well, you can't know anything that happened 2,000 years ago. And what they fail to understand is that the crucial gap is not the gap between the time of the evidence and today. The crucial gap is the gap between the evidence and the events described by that evidence. If the gap between the events and the evidence for those events is short, then how long it has been since the evidence in those events to the present day is just irrelevant. Good evidence doesn't become bad evidence simply because of the lapse of time. And with regard to the New Testament, when we look at the evidence, what we discover is that these records of the life of Jesus were written down within the first generation after those events, while the eyewitnesses were still alive, with people who had firsthand contact with those who had accompanied Jesus during his lifetime. So that we actually have better sources for the life of Jesus of Nazareth than we do for most of the major figures of antiquity. For example, take Alexander the Great, the great Greek conqueror. Our earliest biographies, earliest sources for Alexander the Great, come from Arrian and Plutarch 400 years after Alexander's death. And yet, Greco-Roman historians still regard these records as fairly trustworthy accounts of the life of Alexander the Great. The fabulous legends about Alexander didn't arise until the centuries following those two authors. And contrast that to the New Testament, where we have books and records that are written within the first generation after the events while the eyewitnesses are still alive. So I think that we have very good evidence for the life of Jesus of Nazareth, very trustworthy evidence, and how long it has been since that evidence till today is simply irrelevant to the reliability and trustworthiness of that evidence.